handed to me or emailed to me is ready to hand back. Today we're talking about Kierkegaard, and again this is chapter 14 of the text. This is our first official introduction to this word, existentialism. But just as a side note before I get talking too much, this is one of the things that I first read about in a literature class, not a philosophy class, that actually got me excited about this philosophy stuff. And for those of you who might recall reading the chapter, there's probably a good reason why. Existentialism is a philosophy that oftentimes speaks to people. Because unlike the recent more abstract philosophies that we've discussed since the last examination, and indeed some people might say discussed throughout the entire course, philosophers have tended towards abstract explanations of things. Instead, existentialism is concerned with what? And I'll give you almost a verbatim definition from the text. It's concerned with meaning, value, and choice as they what? As they affect the individual. Concerns with meaning, value, and choice as they affect the individual. Most of the philosophies we've discussed recently haven't really been concerned with the individual. They have been concerned with talking about what rational beings should do. And if a rational being should do it, I should do it too, according to Kant. Utilitarians were concerned with the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Nobody technically counts any more than anybody else counts. And interestingly enough, if my commitments conflict with the greater good, according to utilitarianism, which ought to be sacrificed? My commitments. In other words, from an existential standpoint, these things would seem to devalue the individual. And just one more thing by point of contrast and point of review. Even Karl Marx, who quite honestly has a fairly humanist take when it comes to his concerns. Because remember this, and this is something you may have missed in the text because the text didn't emphasize it enough in my opinion. Marx was very much concerned with the well-being of individuals. He believed that ideally we spend so much time working that we should actually find work that we find to be what? Meaningful. Edifying. And if we don't find those kinds of things, there's a good chance that we will be alienated in the sense that he was talking about. And by the way, most American workers are actually alienated according to Marx's account. Because most people decide what jobs to get, not based upon their passions. But they say, how much is it going to pay? When you think that way, you've technically reduced yourself to just one more commodity. And I want this to sound just as blunt as it sounds. If I were talking to a physician and I said, well, why did you want to get into this profession in the first place? Because, well, I wanted to make a lot of money. I say, well, I think I'm going to go to another doctor's office. You get my drift there? In our system, we're often taught that money brings about excellence in people. If a person drives to get rich, they're likely to do the job better. No, they're likely to find ways of making money better. You get the distinction? As a matter of fact, if it's all about the money for them, they might actually be incentivized to cut as many corners as possible. Do you understand what I mean? I don't want a person taking care of my health who wants to be a billion-dollar doctor. I want someone taking care of me who actually has a passion for making people well. Now this is the way Karl Marx saw work. We ought to be passionate about and care about our work. So Marx did very much care about human beings. But here's where someone like Kierkegaard would have a beef with Karl Marx. Even in his zeal to edify individual lives, remember we had to turn ourselves into what to get there? Fellow workers. In other words, you become just one more abstraction in your road to individual economic relative freedom. In other words, we are all leveled to fellow workers. Abstractions yet again. So yeah, existentialism is concerned with individuals living in the world. Now keep in mind, I don't want to go over all the details of his bio, except where it's particularly relevant in a few minutes. Now some of you answered that homework question about Kierkegaard is well known for making the claim, objectivity is untruth. Now, don't commit a straw man of him here. He is not suggesting that objectivity does not have its usefulness and it doesn't have its place. For example, he understood that scientific methods attempt to look at reality objectively in order to understand things better and solve problems. He was not saying that objective analyses were not good for certain things. What he was suggesting, though, is that if we understand ourselves objectively, that not only won't we find meaning in life, but we are likely to even further devalue human life. Because objectively speaking, what am I really? I am a biological machine is what I am, with working parts. I've got thoughts that can be explained in terms of neurons and synapses firing. And by the way, I imagine if a good behavioral psychologist and a good cognitive scientist got together, they could probably explain every damn thing about me and predict all the choices I would make. And their analysis might not just be an objectively reasonable one, they might actually get me right. In other words, science might be able to objectively explain what a human being is. Someone like Kierkegaard would say, there are aspects of that might not be such a good thing. Because a human being is not just an objective abstraction. We are this, according to Kierkegaard. We are subjects. What does it mean to say I am a subject? And why is being a subject a little more complicated than just, breathing in, breathing out, and shoving food in my gob? A subject is a person that possesses this peculiar thing that we call consciousness. Science may someday be able to explain how consciousness arose in high-functioning neural systems like ours. Kierkegaard would say no matter for that, because there is still something to having this thing that we call experience. You might be able to explain my experience objectively, but that doesn't deny the fact that my experience is still real. And my experience, and making sense of my experience, matters very much to whom? Me. Making sense of my experience. And some of you said this in the homework question, and as soon as I saw that word, I knew you at least on some level got it. Subjects such as ourselves care very deeply about finding this thing called meaning. Now, folks, I'm going to get slightly ahead of things a little bit because this word does not show up in the Kierkegaard chapter. It actually shows up in the chapter on Nietzsche. That word I want to drop is nihilism. By the way, you may also hear it pronounced nihilism. Both pronunciations are considered to be appropriate according to the American Heritage Dictionary. If you're a Coen Brothers film fan, you are more likely to pronounce it nihilist. Because if you've seen the film The Big Lebowski, oh, those guys are a bunch of nihilists. You don't want to mess with them. They don't believe in anything. Yeah, that's a line out of the film. By the way, it's rather funny. It's an absurdist comedy. I highly recommend it. And you can't go wrong with Jeff Bridges. Sorry, my film criticism is showing here. But anyway, nihilism literally means this. It literally means nothing or nothingness. Now guess what? That doesn't fully explain conceptually what we mean by nihilism. Nihilism is the claim that the universe has no inherent meaning. It's the claim that the universe has no inherent meaning. Now, this isn't Kierkegaard speaking, this is Nietzsche speaking. What made people aware of this very real possibility? This is a line from Friedrich Nietzsche.
Death of God.
Thank you. Yeah, Nietzsche talks about this social phenomenon that he calls the death of God. Now, why does the death of God matter so much? Well, the answer runs like this. Many people believe that if God exists, God is the architect and creator of all things. God had a plan, and whatever meaning God assigns to the creation of the universe is the real meaning that it possesses. Now, Nietzsche noted that this would mean that if there is no God, then the universe, in fact, has no inherent meaning. And here's the rub. And this is a line not from Nietzsche, but I'm going to drop a line from existential literary figure Albert Camus. And yes, it is Camus. It is not Camus. Good, I got a couple of chuckles there. In his Myth of Sisyphus and other writings, Albert Camus discusses this by talking about a concept. It's not in the text, by the way, but it is mentioned in my readings. He mentions that the human condition is absurd. And he defines the absurdity of the human condition this way. He says, the universe lacks inherent meaning. There is no meaning or purpose to the universe's existence. It merely what? It is brutally there. It is a fact. The existential writer Jean-Paul Sartre refers to that as facticity. The universe is merely brutally there. But there are these unfortunate beings who desire not just to create our own meaning. We wish the world had a purpose. We wish that there was an inherent meaning. And this is because, to use a line from Kierkegaard, this is why he says mankind is forlorn. How many of you saw that word forlorn? He says mankind is forlorn. And by the way, Jean-Paul Sartre directly paraphrases Kierkegaard on that. He says mankind is forlorn. To say that we are forlorn is to say that we are alone in the universe. Now, Sartre's an atheist, and he says we are alone in the world without God. Kierkegaard's a Christian, but he nonetheless says we are alone in the world, except he doesn't say without God. Now, how how is it that a Christian like Kierkegaard, a Christian existentialist, would still say we are alone in the world? Because we are still in a position, even if we believe in God, to figure out what God wants. And not just to figure out what God wants abstractly. And you may have seen this in the text. I think it's very powerful. I love Kierkegaard, I will admit, even though I don't agree with him on everything. But he says, we still have to figure out what God wants of me. I'm a subject. I am not an abstraction. God does not want the same abstract thing from every single person, because we're not what? We're not abstractions. We're persons. We're selves. We are not just clone carbon copies of one another. We are flesh and bone human beings that possess consciousness. We think about things. We have doubts. We seek purpose in our lives. We want to know what it means to be a human being. We want to live lives worth calling human lives. We are not just beasts. If we were beasts, most of us would be satisfied with this reality. This is not in the book, but it can be inferred from the book. On one level, my life can be explained with this pithy little slogan: birth, school, work, death. Birth, school, work, death. Yeah, and every damn day is pretty much like what? Is pretty much like the last one. Now, I'm speaking not so much like Kierkegaard here, but for those of you who have read ahead and tried to interact with the readings for that last paper. I am characterizing the human condition via this narrative in a way that is not all that different from Camus' characterization of the human condition in his very well-known essay called The Myth of Sisyphus. It's the title track for his book, The Myth of Sisyphus and Other Writings. He borrows Sisyphus from ancient Greek mythology. He is the guy who was condemned by the gods to meaningless, eternal toil. He was the one who was condemned to do what? To push a rock up a hill by day, and he finally gets the rock to the top. What happens? It rolls back down. To which he has to walk back down, roll the rock back up, to which it rolls back down. In a way that typifies the human condition, according to Camus. Because it turns out that for every single goal that you set for yourself, if it's too grandiose a goal, pardon my vulgarity, you're pretty much screwed. How many of you know what I mean by that? So many of the things that I would like to make of myself, I will never be able to make of myself. My wife wanted to write the great American novel. Now, of course, I've told her that if you want to write the great American novel, you've at least got to what? You've got to at least try to write the piece of crap novel first. In other words, you've got to set pen to paper. I guess now it's hands to keyboard now. You at least got to start out by setting hands to keyboard. In other words, you got to do a damn thing if you want to create something. But yeah, you know how it goes. The person setting out to write the great American novel is likely to get rejected, and rejected. In other words, you're likely to struggle your whole life if you make your meaning something grandiose like that. Now notice that writing the great American novel is not inherently more meaningful than any other activity that I can think of. Does anyone know why, from a nihilist standpoint? Writing the great American novel is no more inherently valuable than the person who just decides to sit around and watch Robot Chicken all day long, or pick something else. I mean, I could imagine someone sitting around watching Robot Chicken all day long and drinking Budweiser or whatever. That's not good taste, but I could imagine someone doing it. Why is writing the great American novel not inherently more meaningful than laying around watching TV all day? Or think of some of the just like way out of this world lives that people live that you find on Dr. Phil. Because Dr. Phil's show is now starting to look a little more like Jerry Springer. How many of you know what I'm talking about? People with these wild and crazy lives. I mean, it's Jersey Shore on steroids, or I guess now is it Florida Bama? Is that the new MTV show? But anyway, yeah, I saw more TV this weekend than I was happy to see. But anyway, yeah, too long in a stupid hotel room. Anyway, yeah, who cares? Why isn't one any more inherently valuable than the other? Take it away!
Does nothing matter?
Yes! Because in the grand scheme of things, as the great thinkers Bill and Ted once said, dust, wind, dude. At the end of the day, the great pyramids are gone too. Ozymandias. Nothing matters in the grand scheme of things. All of the goals that we set for ourselves are really just our own goals anyway. And how many of the goals we set are even our own goals anyway? I'm going to get all dark and existential on you now. Not that I wasn't already. Because most of us live our lives entirely this anyway. Most of you will go through your entire lives living your lives inauthentically. And by the way, when I'm saying that to you, I'm also saying it to me. Most of my life has been lived as a passive social construct anyway. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Most of my life has been lived as a passive social construct anyway. In other words, I was too lazy, too oblivious, or lacked the courage to become a subject. As most American males, just like the young Kierkegaard did, he wasn't an American male, a Danish male, but as a young person, I allowed society to tell me what kind of a life I should live and what would constitute a meaningful life. And I had good grades, all that kind of mundane stuff, but I didn't give two you-know-whats about learning. Because those things didn't matter. Learning was merely a means to what? Inauthentic ends. Yeah. What? Yeah, well, first, pleasing my parental figures, who, if you've ever read Freud, you'll know where I'm going with this. We have peculiar relationships with our parents, oftentimes very uneasy ones. Those of us who are lucky enough to have parents who weren't so bad. I know some people don't have that luxury. But yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with my father to this day. And it's not because of an Oedipus complex. Yeah, that I disagree with. But on one level, my father was a little bit like who on earth? The angry God of the Old Testament, who I'm still spending much of my life trying to win his favor. Tell me I don't suck. Tell me I'm not a failure. Tell me I'm not a loser. As if his opinion ought to matter anyway. Do you know what I mean? As if his opinion ought to matter anyway. Because that's already being for others rather than being a subject. But then Mr. Tobinman's right. Then it was a means to money. It was a means to other people respecting me. Because I wasn't good enough to respect myself on my own terms. I needed other people to tell me I wasn't a piece of dirt. But ultimately, and this is the way many young men are taught to feel about themselves, you're supposed to measure yourself in how attractive you are to women. This is, of course, I'm presupposing heterosexuality here. So yeah, I hope I haven't offended anyone there. And in the grand scheme of things, all these things mean what to you at the time? They mean so very much to you at the time. Even though most of those choices I made were never made how? Most of them were never made consciously. And when I say they weren't made consciously, I mean I really didn't meaningfully think any of them through. As Kierkegaard would say, I should have been asking, who am I? Is this the person I want to be? And by the way, this takes a lot. Asking these existential questions takes a little more of this than I think I've ever had in my life. Sorry. It takes a lot of courage. Becoming an individual, as Kierkegaard would put it, is something that all of us should strive for. Because otherwise, you're just a type. You're not really an individual. But you know what the problem is with becoming an individual? You'll be sort of like Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. To bear a ring of power, Frodo, is to be alone. Well, becoming authentic, similar, for those of you who are not total nerds and didn't get that at all. But yeah, to be a subject in Kierkegaard's sense might mean to be alone. Because number one, most people don't think like this. I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying that. Most people don't ask these questions about their being all that much. Most people go through life passively going through the motions. And by the way, Kierkegaard would say this is not much like really living. It's not fully living. But yeah, to courageously try to decide for yourself, this is the person I want to be. And to make those choices authentically, and I hope you remember reading about this, authenticity means to make choices for oneself and on one's own without having concern for what the group thinks and also without any guarantees. And also without any guarantees. By the way, authenticity for him as a Christian is deeply associated with what important five-letter word for the Christian religion? Oh, come on. It's a five-letter word? It's probably the most important concept in Christianity. Come on! Faith! Faith! People of faith! Just tell me you all knew that and just weren't telling me. Faith! Yes, yeah, we all knew that one. Yeah, faith. For Kierkegaard, and I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit here, he would argue that most of his Christian compadres